My name is Cecilia, and for 28 years, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought it was the way I held my newborn son against my chest at 3 in the morning, whispering promises into his tiny ear while the rest of the world slept. I thought it was the way I worked double shifts at the diner, my feet swollen and aching, just so he could have the sneakers his classmates wore. I thought it was the sacrifice I made when I turned down marriage proposals because no man seemed good enough for the little boy who called me Mama and meant it with his whole heart. I was wrong about so many things. The realization came on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting around my son David's dining room table, the mahogany one I'd helped him pick out when he first moved in with Rebecca. The wood gleamed under the chandelier light, reflecting the faces of people I barely recognized anymore, even though one of them had grown inside my body and taken his first breath while holding my finger. "Mom, could you pass the salt?" David asked, not really looking at me. His attention was focused on Rebecca's parents, the Williamses, who had driven down from their estate in Connecticut for what Rebecca had called a proper family dinner. I reached for the crystal salt shaker, another wedding gift I'd contributed to but would never be able to afford for myself, and handed it across the table. That's when it happened. That's when my world split open like an overripe fruit, exposing the rot that had been growing inside for months. "You know," David said, settling back in his chair with the confident smile I remembered from his childhood, back when that expression had been reserved for me. "Rebecca's mother was just telling us about her latest charity board appointment, the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. Can you imagine? My mother-in-law is helping decide which artists get funding for their exhibitions." Mrs. Williams smiled with the gracious modesty of someone accustomed to being admired. "Oh, it's really nothing special. I just happen to know some people, and when they needed someone with experience in cultural affairs," she waved her manicured hand dismissively, but I could see the pride in her posture, the way she sat straighter when David spoke about her accomplishments. "Unlike some people," David continued, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten with dread, "my mother-in-law actually achieved something meaningful with her life. She went to Vassar, you know, art history degree. Married Dad right after graduation, but she never stopped being involved in important work." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't put out. I felt every person at that table turn to look at me, not directly, but with those sideways glances that people use when they're witnessing something uncomfortable but don't want to be caught staring. Rebecca studied her wine glass with sudden fascination. Her father cleared his throat and asked David about his work at the law firm. Mrs. Williams smiled at me with the kind of pitying expression usually reserved for stray animals. But David wasn't finished. He never was, once he got started on a subject that made him feel important. "I mean, it's not that I'm not grateful," he said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Mom did her best, I'm sure. Single mothers don't have a lot of options. But there's something to be said for having parents who can actually contribute to society. You know, people who understand culture, who move in the right circles, who can open doors." I sat there, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening to my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father disappeared into the night like a bad dream, the child I'd read to every evening even when exhaustion made the words blur together, the young man whose college tuition I'd paid with money I'd saved $1 at a time in a mason jar hidden behind the flour canister, reduce my entire existence to nothing more than a regrettable necessity. "Rebecca's mother was just saying how important it is to expose children to the finer things," David continued, warming to his theme like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Art museums, classical music, literature that matters. I think that's why Rebecca and I connect so well intellectually. We both had that kind of upbringing." Rebecca finally looked up from her wine, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been discomfort flicker across her face, but she didn't speak. She didn't correct him, didn't remind him that I was the one who had taken him to the public library every Saturday, the one who had saved for months to buy him his first guitar, the one who had driven 3 hours each way to take him to art museums in the city because I believed education mattered, even if I couldn't afford the private schools and cultural advantages that money could buy. "David," Rebecca said softly, and I felt a moment of hope that maybe, finally, someone would speak up for me. Perhaps we should talk about something else. But David was riding the wave of his own eloquence, drunk on the approval he saw in Mrs. Williams's eyes. "I'm just saying, there's a difference between surviving and thriving. Some people spend their whole lives just getting by, and others actually make an impact. It's not anyone's fault, really. It's just how things work out. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the antique clock in the hallway ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours. I could hear the soft clink of silverware against china as the Williamses continued eating, pretending this conversation wasn't happening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, so loud I was certain everyone else could hear it too. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know what city you're watching from. That's when I understood that the little boy I'd loved so completely had grown into a man who saw me as an embarrassment, a limitation he'd overcome rather than a foundation he'd built upon. I was sitting at his table, eating food I'd helped pay for with my grocery store job, in a house I'd contributed to the down payment for, listening to him explain to strangers why I didn't matter, why I'd never mattered, why his real inspiration came from people who'd never held his fevered head at 2 a.m. or missed their own meals to make sure he had enough to eat. I took a small bite of the green beans I'd brought, the only dish on the table that came from my kitchen, and swallowed past the knot in my throat. They tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing anymore. When dinner finally ended and I helped clear the dishes, Mrs. Williams touched my arm with what I'm sure she thought was kindness. "Thank you for raising such a wonderful son," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes wrapped in compliments. "It must have been so difficult, doing it all alone." I smiled and nodded, because that's what you do when you're invisible. You smile and nod and pretend you don't understand that you're being dismissed, that your life's work is being reduced to something that was difficult rather than something that was miraculous, something that required strength these people couldn't imagine. That night, I drove home to my small apartment, the one David had helped me find after selling the house where he'd grown up, where every room held memories of the life we'd built together. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt different now. It wasn't just empty, it was hollow, echoing with the sound of my own footsteps and the realization that the person I'd loved most in the world had been practicing how to erase me. I sat on my second-hand couch and looked at the photo on the side table. David in his graduation cap and gown, his arm around me, both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world together. I wondered when he'd stopped seeing that woman in the picture as his mother and started seeing her as his burden, but something else was stirring in the quiet of that apartment, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was there too. It was something deeper, something that had been buried under decades of putting someone else first. It was the sound of my own voice, whispering in the darkness, "Who were you before you became his mother?" And for the first time in 28 years, I didn't have an answer, but I was ready to find one. The weeks that followed that dinner felt like watching a slow-motion car accident. You can see what's coming, but you're powerless to stop it. David's calls, which had never been frequent, became even more sporadic. When he did phone, our conversations felt scripted, like he was checking items off a list of filial obligations. "How are you, Mom?" he'd ask, but I could hear the distraction in his voice, the sound of someone multitasking, probably scrolling through emails or organizing his desk while we talked. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I'd answer, because that's what mothers do. We say we're fine even when we're drowning. "How's work? How's Rebecca?" "Good, good. Listen, I can't talk long. We're having dinner with the Williamses again tonight. They're helping us plan the holiday party for the firm." The holiday party. I remembered when David used to spend Christmas Eve with me, helping me wrap presents for the neighbors' children, sharing stories and hot chocolate while snow fell outside our little house. Now, his holidays were planned by people who measured worth in social connections and cultural capital. "That sounds lovely," I said, swallowing the question I wanted to ask. "Am I invited to anything this Christmas?" "Yeah, Rebecca's really excited. Her mom knows all the right people for catering and decorations. You know how these things are. Image matters in my line of work." I didn't know, actually. I'd never been in a line of work where image mattered more than competence, where your mother's education level could impact your career prospects. But I was learning. The first family gathering I wasn't invited to was Rebecca's birthday dinner in December. I found out about it through a photo David posted on social media, a picture of the whole family raising glasses in what looked like an expensive restaurant. Rebecca's parents were there, her sister and brother-in-law, even Rebecca's college roommate who'd flown in from Chicago. I stared at that photo for 20 minutes, zooming in on David's face, trying to find some sign that he'd missed me, that my absence had registered as anything more than one less person to coordinate schedules around. His smile looked genuine, relaxed. He looked like a man who had everything he needed right there in that frame. The caption read, "Celebrating my beautiful wife with all our favorite people. So grateful for this amazing family. All our favorite people." The words echoed in my mind for days. When had I stopped being one of David's favorite people? When had the woman who used to be his whole world become someone who didn't even merit an invitation to his wife's birthday? I called him the next day, trying to keep my voice light. I saw the photos from Rebecca's birthday. It looked like a wonderful evening. There was a pause. "Oh, yeah, it was nice. Small gathering, you know." Rebecca wanted to keep it intimate. Intimate. 8 people was intimate, but apparently 9 would have been a crowd. "I would have loved to take her to lunch sometime this week," I offered, "to celebrate properly." Another pause. Longer this time. "That's really sweet, Mom, but Rebecca's pretty busy with work right now, and we're trying to be more selective about our social commitments. You understand? Selective." The word hit me like a slap. I was no longer David's mother in his mind. I was a social commitment to be managed, scheduled, or avoided based on convenience and image considerations. Christmas was worse. For 27 years, David and I had maintained the same tradition. Christmas Eve at my place, just the 2 of us, with homemade cookies and the old ornaments I'd collected since he was born. Each decoration told a story: his handprint in clay from kindergarten, the paper angel he'd made in Sunday school, the ceramic tree he'd painted at summer camp. That year, he called on December 20th to tell me plans had changed. "Rebecca's family does this big Christmas Eve thing at their country house," he explained, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone describing an upgrade. "It's been their tradition for decades. Her grandmother started it back in the 50s. Black tie dinner, live music, the whole works. I can't really say no." "Of course not," I said, sitting in my small living room surrounded by the decorations I'd already put up, the same ones we'd hung together every year since he was tall enough to reach the lower branches. "What about Christmas Day?" "Well, that's the thing. We're staying the whole weekend up there. Rebecca's extended family comes in from all over the country. Her mom's really excited about introducing me to everyone." I could picture it. David in a tuxedo, charming Rebecca's relatives with stories about his legal career, fitting seamlessly into their world of old money and inherited traditions. No one would ask about his childhood, about the woman who'd raised him. His history would begin with law school, with meeting Rebecca, with becoming the kind of man who belonged at country house Christmas parties. "Maybe we could do something the week after," I suggested, hating the pleading note that had crept into my voice. "Maybe. Let me check our calendar. January's pretty packed with work stuff." That was the moment I realized I wasn't losing my son gradually. I had already lost him. He was simply too polite, or too guilty, to make it official. Christmas Eve, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by decorations that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I'd made the cookies anyway, out of habit, and they sat cooling on the counter with no one to eat them. I thought about taking them to the elderly woman next door, Mrs. Chen, but even that felt like admitting defeat. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, though that was crushing enough. The worst part was the way I'd started to see myself through David's eyes, through Rebecca's family's eyes. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw a woman who'd accomplished something remarkable by raising a successful son on her own. Instead, I saw exactly what they saw: someone ordinary, unremarkable, whose greatest achievement was simply surviving circumstances that better people would have handled with more grace and style. I started avoiding the grocery store where I'd worked for 15 years, taking longer routes to my apartment so I wouldn't have to see my former co-workers. Not because I was ashamed of the work. I'd never been ashamed of honest labor, but because I could no longer shake the feeling that everyone could see what David saw when he looked at me. A woman who'd never achieved anything meaningful, who'd spent her life just getting by. When I ran into David's former teacher, Mrs. Patterson, at the pharmacy in January, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Cecilia, I heard David's doing so well at his law firm. You must be so proud." I smiled and nodded, because that's what you do. "Very proud. I remember how hard you worked to make sure he had everything he needed for school." All those extra hours you picked up at the diner, the way you'd sit with him at the kitchen table helping with homework even after those long shifts. He was lucky to have you, Mrs. Patterson's words should have been comforting, but instead, they felt like epitaphs, tributes to a version of myself that no longer existed, at least not in the eyes of the person who mattered most. He's made a wonderful life for himself, I said, which was true, just not a life that included me. That night, I found myself going through old photo albums, looking for evidence of the mother I used to be. There I was, beaming at David's high school graduation. There we were on his first day of college, both of us trying not to cry as we unloaded his dorm room. There I was at his law school graduation, so proud I thought my heart might burst. In every picture, I looked like a woman who believed her sacrifices mattered, who trusted that love and dedication would be enough to build something lasting. I looked like someone who'd never imagined that success could be a weapon used against the very person who'd made it possible. But as I stared at those photos, something else began to surface beneath the hurt. It was small at first, barely a whisper, but it was there. Anger. Not the hot, destructive kind that burns everything in its path, but the cold, clarifying kind that cuts through self-pity and delusion like a knife through fog. I closed the photo album and walked to my bedroom closet, pushing aside the practical clothes I'd worn for years, the sensible shoes, the modest blouses, the cardigans chosen for durability rather than style. In the very back, wrapped in tissue paper, was something I'd almost forgotten I owned, the dress I'd bought for David's law school graduation. It was deep blue, more elegant than anything I'd worn before or since, purchased with money I'd saved for 3 months because I'd wanted to look worthy of standing beside my successful son. I held it up to the light, remembering how beautiful I'd felt that day, how proud and hopeful, how naive. But looking at that dress now, I didn't feel naive. I felt like I was remembering something important about the woman I used to be, before I learned to see myself through other people's eyes. Before I accepted that being a devoted mother meant disappearing as a person. Maybe it was time to stop disappearing. February brought an unexpected phone call that made my heart leap with hope I didn't know I still carried. Rebecca's voice, usually distant and polite, sounded almost warm when she asked if I'd like to help with David's surprise 30th birthday party. "I know how much you care about him," she said, and for a moment, I felt like I was being invited back into my son's life. "I thought maybe you could help with some of the planning. You know him better than anyone." I said yes before she'd even finished explaining the details. Of course I said yes. This was my chance to show them I wasn't just some relic from David's past. I was still his mother, still someone who could contribute something meaningful to his happiness. We met at a coffee shop in Rebecca's neighborhood, one of those places where a simple latte costs more than I used to spend on lunch for a week. Rebecca looked effortlessly elegant in the way that comes from never having to choose between looking nice and paying the electric bill. Her hair was perfectly styled, her nails professionally manicured, her clothes the kind of understated expensive that whispers rather than shouts about money. "I was thinking we could do something sophisticated," she said, pulling out a leather-bound notebook filled with color-coordinated tabs and neat handwriting. "David's been talking about how much he's learned to appreciate fine wine since we've been married. Maybe a wine-tasting theme?" I nodded enthusiastically, already imagining how I could contribute. "That sounds wonderful. I could make some of his favorite foods. You know, the lasagna he's always loved, or those chocolate chip cookies I used to bake for his birthday every year." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's sweet, but I was thinking more elevated. I've already spoken to a caterer who specializes in wine pairings. They do these beautiful small plates that complement different varietals. Very sophisticated." Sophisticated. There was that word again, the one that seemed to define everything I wasn't. "Of course," I said quickly. "That sounds perfect. What else can I help with?" "Well," Rebecca consulted her notebook, "I need someone to handle the RSVPs and maybe help with some of the decorations. Nothing too complicated, just following the guidelines I've set up." I spent the next 3 weeks throwing myself into party planning with the desperation of someone trying to prove their worth. I called every person on Rebecca's guest list, carefully noting dietary restrictions and confirming attendance in the spreadsheet she'd created. I researched wine-themed decorations online, staying up late to compare prices and find the best deals that would fit the sophisticated aesthetic she'd described. The guest list itself was a revelation. 35 people were invited to celebrate my son's 30th birthday, and I recognized perhaps 5 names. His law school friends, Rebecca's college roommates, colleagues from his firm, the Williamses and their extended social circle, a carefully curated collection of people who represented the life David had built since graduation. None of his childhood friends made the list. Not Marcus, who'd been his best friend from 3rd grade through high school. Not Sarah, who'd been his study partner through college and had driven 6 hours to attend his graduation. Not Mrs. Patterson, his favorite teacher, or Coach Williams, who'd believed in him when he wanted to quit the debate team junior year. When I gently asked Rebecca about including some of David's older friends, she waved the suggestion away. David's really focused on his professional network these days. He's trying to make partner, you know. It's important that he's surrounded by the right people. The right people. I wondered where that left me. The night before the party, I arrived at David and Rebecca's house early to help set up. I'd spent my grocery money for the month on a new outfit. A navy blue blouse and black slacks that I hoped struck the right note between festive and sophisticated. I'd even splurged on a professional manicure, something I'd never done before, because I wanted my hands to look appropriate when I helped serve the wine. "Oh, Cecilia, you're here," Rebecca said when she opened the door. She looked stunning in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my rent. "Actually, I think we have the decorating covered. The caterer brought their own team." I stood on the doorstep holding a bag of supplies I'd carefully chosen. Elegant string lights, wine-themed centerpieces I'd assembled myself, candles in the exact shade of burgundy Rebecca had specified. "I thought I could help with the final touches, maybe arrange the flowers." "That's so thoughtful, but the florist is handling all of that. They have a very specific vision." Rebecca's smile was polite but firm. "Maybe you could just mingle with the guests when they arrive? David will be so happy to see you." Mingle. Like I was just another guest instead of the woman who'd planned his first 29 birthday parties, who knew that he preferred chocolate cake to vanilla and always requested extra frosting roses because they made him laugh. I spent the party standing in corners, watching my son move through rooms filled with people who saw him as an investment, a networking opportunity, a ticket to social advancement. Everyone had stories about David the lawyer, David the rising star, David the perfect husband. No one asked about David the little boy who used to be afraid of thunderstorms, or David the teenager who'd cried when our neighbor's dog died, or David the college student who'd called me every Sunday just to hear my voice. The worst moment came when Rebecca's father stood up to make a toast. "To David," he said, raising his glass of wine that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, "who has shown us what it means to rise above your circumstances and create something beautiful. We're proud to call him family." Rise above your circumstances. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment. I felt every eye in the room flicker toward me, some curious, some pitying, all understanding exactly what circumstances David had risen above. His mother, his past. The woman who'd raised him was now the limitation he'd successfully overcome. David beamed at the praise, raising his own glass. "Thank you, Richard. I'm grateful every day for the family I've found, for the people who've shown me what's possible when you surround yourself with excellence." The family he'd found, not the family he'd been born into, but the one he'd chosen to replace it with. After the toast, I approached David while he was standing with a group of his colleagues, hoping for just a moment of connection, a chance to remind him that someone in that room had loved him before he'd accomplished anything worthy of admiration. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, touching his arm gently. 30 years old. I can hardly believe it. He turned to me with a smile that looked genuine until I noticed it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Mom. Great party, right?" Rebecca really outdid herself. "She did," I agreed. "It's beautiful. I just wanted to tell you how proud I am." "Actually," one of his colleagues interrupted, "David, I wanted to introduce you to my wife. She's been dying to meet Rebecca's husband." And just like that, I was dismissed. Not rudely, not dramatically, just erased from the conversation as if I'd never been part of it. David turned away without finishing our conversation, without acknowledging what I'd been trying to say, without seeming to notice that I was left standing alone while he charmed people who cared about his potential rather than his past. I stayed for another hour, nursing a single glass of wine that tasted like expensive disappointment, watching my son perform the role of the successful young lawyer who'd emerged fully formed from law school with no messy backstory to complicate his narrative. When I finally gathered my courage to say goodbye, David was surrounded by a group of partners from his firm, discussing some case that had everyone nodding appreciatively at his insights. I waited for a break in the conversation, then stepped forward. "I should head home," I said quietly. "Thank you for including me." "Oh, okay," David said, glancing at his watch. "Drive safely. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming." Like I was a distant relative who'd made an unexpected appearance, rather than the woman who'd given him life and spent 30 years making sure he had everything he needed to become the man everyone was now celebrating. I walked to my car alone, past the luxury vehicles that lined their street, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the warm light spilling from the house where my son was surrounded by people who'd known him for months or years instead of decades. In my rearview mirror, I could see the party continuing without me, conversations flowing, laughter rising, my absence as unnoticed as my presence had been. That's when I finally understood what I'd been refusing to see. I wasn't being gradually excluded from David's life. I'd already been written out of it entirely. The invitations, the phone calls, the polite inclusion in events like this party were just formalities, ways of managing guilt rather than expressions of genuine love. I drove home through streets that seemed darker than usual, past houses where other families were probably sharing quiet Sunday evenings, where mothers and sons might be talking about something other than professional networking and social advancement. In my apartment, I sat on my couch and looked at the gift I'd brought to the party, but never had a chance to give him. A photo album I'd made of his childhood, filled with pictures from birthdays when his biggest wish was for us to spend the whole day together, when blowing out candles on a homemade cake was the height of celebration. I realized I'd been holding on to a ghost, loving a memory of a boy who'd grown into a man I no longer recognized. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop trying to resurrect something that had been buried so completely that even I was starting to forget what it had looked like when it was alive. The weeks after David's birthday party passed in a gray haze of routine and resignation. I went through the motions of living, showering, dressing, grocery shopping, paying bills, but everything felt mechanical, like I was operating my own life from a distance. The woman in the mirror looked familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone else's existence unfold. I stopped calling David altogether, not out of anger, though anger was there, simmering beneath the surface like water about to boil. I stopped calling because I finally understood that my voice had become an interruption in his life, a reminder of a chapter he was eager to close. Every conversation had felt like an imposition. Every, "How are you?" a burden he was too polite to refuse, but too distant to genuinely answer. The silence was deafening. Days turned into weeks, and my phone remained stubbornly quiet. No check-ins, no casual conversations, no invitations to anything. The absence of his voice in my life created a hollow space that seemed to expand with each passing day, filling with the echo of all the words we'd never say to each other again. I found myself sitting in the same chair every evening, the one by the window that looked out onto the parking lot where other people came and went with the comfortable rhythm of lives that had purpose and direction. Mrs. Chen from next door would wave when she saw me, sometimes bringing mail that had been delivered to the wrong apartment, always asking how I was with the genuine concern of someone who understood loneliness. "Your son," she said one evening, standing in my doorway with a package that belonged to me. "He doesn't visit much anymore?" I forced a smile, the same one I'd been practicing for months. "He's very busy with work. You know how it is with young people these days." Mrs. Chen nodded, but her eyes held the kind of knowing that comes from having lived long enough to recognize pain when it's wearing the mask of pride. "My daughter in California," she said softly. "She calls every week. Same time, every Sunday. Some things shouldn't be too busy for, you know?" After she left, I sat with her words echoing in the empty apartment. Some things shouldn't be too busy for. But apparently, I had become one of those things that could be postponed indefinitely, scheduled around more important priorities, forgotten in the rush toward whatever future David was building without me. March arrived with the kind of relentless rain that makes everything look gray and worn down. I'd been living on savings and the small severance package from my last job, but the money was disappearing faster than I'd calculated. The electric bill arrived with a disconnect notice attached. The rent was due in a week, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't sure I could pay it. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by bills and calculator tape, trying to make numbers add up to something other than disaster. No matter how I rearranged the figures, how I prioritized which bills could wait and which ones couldn't. The mathematics of poverty remained unforgiving. I was short, not by a little, but by enough to matter, enough to change everything. That's when I did something I'd never imagined I would do. I picked up the phone and dialed David's number, my hands shaking as I listened to it ring. "Hello?" His voice sounded distracted, like he was multitasking. "David, it's Mom." The words felt strange in my mouth, formal and uncertain. "Oh, hi. Is everything okay?" There was a note of concern in his voice, but it was the kind of concern you'd show for an acquaintance, not a parent. I stopped, swallowing the pride that felt like broken glass in my throat. "I'm having some financial difficulties. I was wondering if maybe you could help, just temporarily, until I find another job." The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice had taken on the careful tone he probably used with difficult clients. "Mom, I've been meaning to talk to you about this. Rebecca and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it might be time for you to consider some changes. Maybe look into senior living communities. Some of them are really nice, and they're designed for people in your circumstances." Senior living communities. At 58, I was being relegated to the category of elderly people who needed to be managed by others, whose independence was a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. "I'm not ready for that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need help with a few bills. Maybe a loan. I could pay you back once I'm working again." Another long pause. "I don't think that's a good idea, Mom. Rebecca's father was just saying how important it is to maintain clear financial boundaries in families. It gets complicated when money gets involved." Rebecca's father, the man who'd toasted my son's ability to rise above his circumstances, was now providing advice about how to keep those circumstances at arm's length. "David," I said, and something in my voice must have gotten through to him because he stopped talking. "I raised you. I worked 2 jobs to put you through college. I gave up everything to make sure you had what you needed to become the man you are today. And now you're telling me that helping your mother pay her electric bill would be complicated? Mom, please don't make this dramatic. It's not about what you did for me. It's about what's healthy for everyone involved. Rebecca thinks—" "I don't care what Rebecca thinks," I said, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "I'm not asking Rebecca for help. I'm asking my son." The silence that followed felt different, heavier. When David spoke again, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "I'm sorry you're struggling, but I can't solve your problems for you. Maybe it's time you learned to stand on your own feet instead of always expecting other people to take care of you." The words hit me like a physical blow, always expecting other people to take care of me. This, from the boy I'd carried on my back up 3 flights of stairs when he broke his leg in 4th grade. This, from the teenager I'd driven to work every day for 2 summers because we couldn't afford a second car. This, from the young man whose law school application essays I'd helped him edit, whose student loan papers I'd co-signed, whose confidence I'd built with 28 years of unwavering belief. "David," I whispered, but the line was already dead. I sat in my kitchen holding the silent phone, staring at the bills spread across the table like evidence of a life poorly lived. The rain continued its steady assault on the windows, and somewhere in the building, a neighbor's television murmured with the voices of people pretending to solve problems in 30-minute episodes. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of other people's lives continuing around me. Upstairs, someone was watching late-night television. Next door, Mrs. Chen was probably reading one of the romance novels she borrowed from the library every week. Down the hall, the young couple was having another quiet argument about money or work, or which one of them had forgotten to take out the trash. All around me, people were living lives that had weight and substance and connection, and I was floating in the space between who I used to be and who I was supposed to become, untethered from everything that had once made sense. For the first time since David's birth, I allowed myself to imagine what would have happened if I'd made different choices. What if I'd pursued the art degree I'd dreamed about instead of dropping out of college when I got pregnant? What if I'd moved to the city like I'd planned, instead of staying in our small town because it seemed safer for raising a child? What if I'd dated the kind teacher who'd asked me out when David was in high school, instead of telling him I was too busy to consider romance? What if I'd lived for myself instead of living only for someone who'd grown up to see my sacrifice as an embarrassment? But those questions led nowhere except deeper into the darkness of regret. The truth was, I'd made every choice out of love, and love doesn't come with guarantees or return policies. I'd loved my son with everything I had, and now I was discovering that everything I had wasn't enough to earn a place in the life I'd helped him build. The disconnect notice on the electric bill said I had 72 hours before the power would be shut off. 72 hours to figure out how to pay for the basic utilities that separated civilized life from chaos. 72 hours to find a way forward that didn't involve begging the son who'd already made it clear that my problems weren't his responsibility. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like, but all I could find was the dull ache of a heart that had given everything and received indifference in return. But somewhere, in the space between sleep and waking, a small voice whispered something I'd almost forgotten. You were someone before you became his mother. Maybe it's time to remember who that was. And for the first time in months, I didn't push that voice away. I listened. And in the darkness of my empty apartment, something that had been sleeping for 28 years began to stir. The morning after David's phone call, I woke up with something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. Not the kind that comes from sudden inspiration or divine intervention, but the hard-earned clarity that emerges when you finally hit bottom and realize that the only direction left is up. I made coffee with hands that weren't shaking anymore and sat at my kitchen table, looking at those bills with different eyes. Yes, I was in trouble. Yes, I was alone. But I was also 58 years old, not dead. I had working hands, a functioning mind, and something I'd forgotten I possessed. The same strength that had carried me through single motherhood when I was barely more than a child myself. The woman who'd raised David hadn't been weak. She'd been fierce, resourceful, determined. She'd figured out how to stretch $20 into a week's worth of meals, how to fix a broken washing machine with YouTube tutorials and pure stubbornness, how to help a struggling teenager with calculus homework, despite never having taken the class herself. That woman hadn't disappeared. I'd just been so busy apologizing for her existence that I'd forgotten she was still here. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, were my woodworking tools. My father's tools, actually, passed down to me when he died during David's sophomore year of college. I'd used them sporadically over the years, making small repairs around the house, building David a bookshelf for his first apartment, crafting simple gifts when money was too tight for store-bought presents. The tools felt familiar in my hands, their weight comforting in a way I'd forgotten. There was something honest about working with wood, something that cut through pretense and demanded only skill, patience, and vision. Wood didn't care about your education or your social connections. It responded to competence, nothing more and nothing less. I spent that afternoon in my small storage unit, setting up a makeshift workshop in the space where I'd planned to store furniture when I eventually downsized to something even smaller. The concrete floor wasn't ideal, and the lighting was harsh fluorescent, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I was creating something instead of simply enduring something. My first project was a simple jewelry box, the kind I'd made for David's teachers when he was in elementary school. I'd forgotten how satisfying it was to see rough lumber transform into something beautiful and functional, how the rhythm of sanding and measuring and fitting pieces together could quiet the chaos in my mind. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door that evening, drawn by the sound of sawing and the smell of wood stain drifting through the thin walls. "What are you making?" she asked, peering over my shoulder at the small box taking shape on my work table. "I'm not sure yet," I said, which was true. I knew what the box would become, but I wasn't sure what I was becoming in the process of making it. "My husband, before he died, he made furniture," Mrs. Chen said, running her fingers along the smooth edge I'd been sanding. "Beautiful pieces. Sold them at the farmer's market on weekends. People would commission special pieces, hope chests for weddings, toy boxes for new babies. He said working with wood taught him patience. Did he make a living at it? Good living. Not rich, but comfortable. People always need beautiful things, he used to say. They just don't always know where to find them." That night, I sat with Mrs. Chen's words echoing in my mind. People always need beautiful things. When had I stopped believing I could create beautiful things? When had I decided that my value lay only in what I could sacrifice for others, rather than what I could contribute to the world? I started researching online, learning about local craft fairs and artisan markets. I discovered a whole community of makers, people who'd turned their skills into small businesses, who sold their work through websites and social media, who'd found ways to build sustainable lives around creating things that mattered to them. The learning curve was steep. I spent hours watching YouTube tutorials about photography and lighting, figuring out how to make my simple jewelry boxes look professional enough to sell online. I practiced writing product descriptions that highlighted the craftsmanship and care that went into each piece without sounding desperate or apologetic. My first sale came 3 weeks later. A woman in Oregon who'd found my listing for a small keepsake box and wanted it as a gift for her daughter's graduation, $25 plus shipping. It wasn't much, but when I packaged that box in tissue paper and walked it to the post office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own work. The second sale followed quickly, then a third. Word of mouth, apparently, still mattered in the handmade goods market. People who bought one piece would recommend me to friends, would return for custom orders, would leave reviews that brought new customers to my slowly growing online presence. I reinvested every dollar I earned into better tools, higher quality wood, improved packaging that made my products look as professional as they actually were. I learned about different wood grains and finishes, about joints that would last for generations, about the small details that separated amateur work from true craftsmanship. The storage unit workshop evolved into something more sophisticated. I found a used table saw at an estate sale, negotiated for a better price on bulk lumber from a local supplier, invested in proper lighting that didn't make everything look harsh and industrial. The space began to feel less like a desperate refuge and more like a real business. More importantly, I began to feel less like someone hiding from her failures and more like someone building toward her future. The changes weren't just professional. For the first time in decades, I started making choices based on what I wanted rather than what other people expected from me. I bought clothes that made me feel confident instead of invisible. I cut my graying hair into a style that flattered my face instead of simply being easy to maintain. I said yes when Mrs. Chen invited me to join her book club, even though I hadn't read fiction in years. The book club meetings were held in the community center on Tuesday evenings, and the women who attended were a mix of ages and backgrounds united by their love of stories and their willingness to share opinions about everything from plot structure to character motivation. They welcomed me without question, as if the fact that I showed up was qualification enough for membership. "I haven't done this in forever," I confessed during my first meeting, clutching a paperback copy of the novel they'd assigned with the same nervousness I'd felt on David's first day of kindergarten. "None of us had done it until we started doing it," said Margaret, a retired teacher who'd been leading the group for 8 years. "That's how everything worthwhile begins, with someone deciding to try something new. Someone deciding to try something new." The phrase stayed with me as I drove home that night, as I worked on a custom jewelry box for a customer in Maine, as I fell asleep in my small apartment that no longer felt like a prison, but simply like a starting point. I'd spent so many years defined by my relationship to other people, David's mother, the diner waitress, the grocery store clerk, that I'd forgotten I could be defined by my own choices, my own interests, my own growing skill at creating things that brought beauty into the world. The financial pressure eased gradually, not all at once, and not without careful budgeting and some very lean weeks. But my small business was growing steadily. More importantly, I was growing. Every completed project taught me something new about wood, about craftsmanship, about the satisfaction that comes from creating something lasting with your own hands. I still thought about David, of course. The hurt hadn't disappeared. It had just moved to a different place in my heart, somewhere it could exist without consuming everything else. I'd loved him completely, and that love had produced a successful, educated man who was building the life he wanted. The fact that this life didn't include me was painful, but it wasn't a judgment on the quality of my mothering or the value of my sacrifice. It was simply the reality of raising a child to be independent. Sometimes independence means moving towards something, and sometimes it means moving away from something else. I was learning to accept that both could be true, without either one canceling out the 28 years of love that had come before. On a Thursday evening in late April, while I was putting the finishing touches on a jewelry box that would be shipped to a customer in Texas the next morning, my phone rang. The number was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. David's office. My first instinct was to answer immediately, the way I had for 28 years whenever my son needed something. But I looked at my hands, steady and sure as they applied the final coat of finish to wood that glowed with warmth and beauty, and I made a different choice. I let it go to voicemail, and for the first time since that awful dinner in November, the decision felt like strength rather than fear. I listened to David's voicemail the next morning while I sipped coffee and watched the sunrise through my kitchen window. His voice sounded different, uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager struggling with calculus homework. "Hi, Mom. It's me. I wanted to see how you're doing. Rebecca saw something online and, well, could you call me back? When you get a chance. Rebecca saw something online." The words sparked a mixture of curiosity and apprehension that stayed with me throughout the day as I worked on a custom hope chest for a young woman in Vermont who was getting married in the fall. The piece was my most ambitious project yet, cherry wood with hand-carved details and a cedar lining that would protect the family heirlooms and wedding keepsakes she planned to store inside. It wasn't until that evening, after I'd applied the day's final coat of stain and cleaned my tools with the methodical care my father had taught me decades ago, that I allowed myself to wonder what Rebecca might have seen online that would prompt David to break months of silence. I'd been posting photos of my work on social media, partly for marketing, but mostly because I'd discovered an unexpected joy in sharing the transformation of raw wood into finished pieces. The responses had been encouraging. Comments from strangers who appreciated the craftsmanship, messages from potential customers, shares from people who said my work reminded them of furniture their grandparents had owned, but something else had been happening that I'd been too busy to fully process. Local newspapers had started featuring stories about the resurgence of handmade crafts, and somehow my name had begun appearing in these articles. First as a brief mention in a piece about the farmer's market where I'd started selling smaller pieces. Then, as a more substantial feature in the lifestyle section about women starting businesses later in life. The article that had run the previous week in the regional magazine had surprised me with its depth and focus. The journalist, a woman about my age who'd found my work through a friend's recommendation, had spent an afternoon in my workshop asking questions about my process, my inspiration, the satisfaction I found in creating functional art with my hands. "There's something profound about watching Cecilia Morrison work," the article had begun. "Her hands move with the confidence of someone who understands that true craftsmanship can't be rushed, that beauty emerges from patience and skill rather than shortcuts and mass production." The photographer had captured something in those images that I hadn't seen in my own mirror for years, a woman completely absorbed in her work, competent and focused, creating something meaningful. In one photo, I was bent over a piece of maple, checking the grain pattern before making a crucial cut. In another, I was applying finish with a brush, my face reflecting the concentration of someone who took pride in getting every detail right. But it was the final photo that had stopped me cold when I first saw the magazine. I was holding a completed jewelry box, smiling not at the camera but at the piece itself, my expression full of genuine satisfaction and quiet pride. The woman in that photo looked accomplished, confident, completely at peace with who she was and what she was doing. I barely recognized her as myself. The magazine had run the story with the headline, "Finding Her Voice in Wood, How One Mother's Creative Journey Led to Unexpected Success." Success. The word still felt foreign when applied to my own life, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Orders were coming in faster than I could fill them. I'd had to start a waiting list, something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. People were willing to wait 3 months for one of my pieces, trusting me to create something worth that patience. More importantly, other publications were taking notice. A national crafting magazine had reached out about featuring my work in their holiday issue. A furniture showroom in the city had asked if I'd be interested in consigning some pieces. The local community college had invited me to teach a woodworking workshop for their continuing education program, teaching. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. Standing in front of a group of adults, sharing knowledge I'd accumulated through years of trial and error, helping others discover the same satisfaction I'd found in working with wood. It felt like the natural evolution of everything I'd been building toward. Mrs. Chen had been following my progress with the enthusiasm of someone who understood what it meant to rebuild your life from scratch. "You should be proud," she said one evening, admiring the hope chest I'd nearly finished. Not just of the beautiful work, but of the courage it took to start over. Starting over. I was beginning to understand that's exactly what I'd done, though it hadn't felt courageous at the time. It had felt like survival, like the only choice available when all other options had been exhausted. But maybe courage and survival were more closely related than I'd realized. The book club had become a weekly highlight, not just for the literary discussions but for the friendships that were developing. These women, Margaret the retired teacher, Patricia the former nurse, Susan who'd raised 4 children and was now discovering photography, Janet who'd started learning Spanish at 65, had welcomed me into their circle with the easy acceptance of people who understood that interesting lives often included chapters of reinvention. "I've been thinking about your story," Margaret said one Tuesday evening as we discussed a novel about a woman who'd overcome tremendous obstacles to build a successful business. "The parallels to your own journey are remarkable. Both women had to lose everything they thought they wanted before they could discover what they actually needed. What I actually needed." The phrase lingered with me as I drove home that night. For so many years, I'd thought I needed David's approval, his gratitude, his presence in my life to validate the choices I'd made. I'd measured my worth by his achievements, his happiness, his willingness to include me in the life I'd helped him build. But these past few months had taught me something different. What I actually needed was the satisfaction of creating something meaningful with my own hands, the respect of people who valued craftsmanship and dedication, the quiet confidence that came from knowing I could support myself through my own efforts and ingenuity. I needed to matter not because of my relationship to someone else, but because of who I was and what I contributed to the world. The workshop I'd set up in the storage unit had evolved again, this time into something that looked almost professional. Better lighting, proper ventilation, tool organization that would have made my father proud. I'd invested in a business license, established relationships with suppliers, developed systems for tracking orders and managing customer communications. But more than the external trappings of success, I'd developed something internal that felt even more valuable. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. When people asked about my work now, I didn't apologize or minimize my accomplishments. I talked about wood selection and joinery techniques, about the satisfaction of creating pieces that would be passed down through generations, about the growing market for handcrafted furniture in an increasingly mass-produced world. I talked like someone who knew what she was doing because finally I did. 3 days after David's voicemail, while I was putting the finishing touches on a commissioned bookshelf that would be featured in the furniture showroom's autumn display, my phone rang again. This time, I was ready. "Hello, David. Mom." His voice carried a note of surprise, as if he hadn't expected me to answer. "Thanks for calling me back." "I haven't called you back yet," I said calmly, continuing to work as we talked. "I'm calling you now because I'm ready to talk, not because I feel obligated to return your call immediately." The distinction mattered, though I wasn't sure he would understand why. For 28 years, I'd dropped everything whenever David needed my attention. This time I'd finished what I was working on first. "Oh, okay." Another pause. "Listen, Rebecca saw that article about you in the magazine, the one about your woodworking business." "She did. We had no idea you were, we didn't know you'd started a business. It looks like you're doing really well." Really well. Coming from the son who'd told me to learn to stand on my own feet instead of expecting others to take care of me, the words carried an irony that wasn't lost on either of us. "I am," I said simply. "The article made it sound like you're getting pretty successful. Orders backed up, teaching opportunities, that gallery thing they mentioned. Gallery thing. The furniture showroom that was featuring my work in their next exhibition, treating my pieces as art rather than simple crafts. David's casual dismissal of it told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this conversation. "David," I said, setting down my sandpaper and giving him my full attention for the first time since he'd called. "What exactly do you want?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. I wanted to see how you're doing. To maybe talk about things. Talk about things." After months of silence, after refusing to help when I'd asked for it, after suggesting I needed to learn independence, he wanted to talk now that independence had proven profitable. "I'm doing well," I said. "Better than I have in years, actually." Was there something specific you wanted to discuss? But even as I asked the question, I already knew what was coming. I could hear it in his tone. in the careful way he was choosing his words, in the sudden interest in my life after months of deliberate distance. Something had changed. Something that made my newfound success relevant to him in ways my struggles never had been. And I was finally strong enough to handle whatever that something turned out to be. The conversation with David continued for another 10 minutes, and with each passing moment, the true purpose of his call became clearer. He asked careful questions about my business, how many orders I had, whether I was making good money, if I'd thought about expanding. His tone carried the forced casualness of someone conducting market research while pretending to make small talk. "So this furniture showroom thing," he said, and I could hear him typing in the background, probably looking up the gallery's website while we spoke. "That's pretty prestigious, isn't it? Rebecca's mother mentioned she knows the owner, says it's quite exclusive." Of course, Rebecca's mother knew the owner. Of course, David was checking to see if my success was legitimate by the standards of people whose approval had always mattered more to him than mine. "It's a good opportunity," I said, not bothering to elaborate. Let him do his own research if he was so interested. "Mom, I have to ask, why didn't you tell us about any of this? I mean, if you were struggling financially and you had this business starting up, there it was." The question that revealed everything he still didn't understand about what had happened between us, about why his phone call had gone unanswered for 3 days, about why I was no longer the woman who apologized for her existence and begged for scraps of his attention. "I did tell you I was struggling financially," I said, my voice steady. "I called you in March and asked for help. Do you remember what you told me?" Silence. The typing had stopped. "You told me it was time I learned to stand on my own feet, instead of always expecting other people to take care of me. You told me that helping me would be complicated because Rebecca's father believes in maintaining financial boundaries in families." "Mom, you're right though. I did need to learn to stand on my own feet. And I did. What I'm curious about is why you're calling now, when I no longer need your help, when I'm no longer an embarrassment to your professional image." The words hung between us like a blade, sharp and clean and impossible to ignore. I felt no satisfaction in saying them, no triumph in finally speaking truths that had been buried under months of polite pretense. I felt only the quiet clarity that comes from finally understanding exactly where you stand. "That's not fair," David said, but his protest lacked conviction. "I was just trying to encourage you to be independent." You thought I was a burden," I said. "You thought my struggles reflected poorly on the successful image you were trying to project. You thought the best way to handle your embarrassing mother was to suggest she move to senior living and stop complicating your life with her problems. I never said you were embarrassing. You didn't have to say it, David. You said it with every uninvitation, every canceled plan, every introduction where you somehow forgot to mention that the woman standing next to you was your mother. You said it when you toasted your ability to rise above your circumstances while I sat at your dinner table. You said it when you hung up on me rather than loan me enough money to keep my electricity on." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, less certain than I'd heard it sound since he was a child. "I didn't mean for it to sound like that, but it did sound like that. Because that's what you meant, whether you want to admit it or not." I walked to my window and looked out at the parking lot where Mrs. Chen was helping an elderly man carry groceries to his car. Simple human kindness, offered without calculation or expectation of return. The kind of gesture that had once defined my relationship with my son, back when love wasn't conditional on professional success or social acceptability. "So what happens now?" David asked. It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself since his voicemail had arrived. What did happen now? What did I owe the son who'd discarded me when I was inconvenient and wanted to reconnect now that I was successful? What did a mother do when she'd raised a child to be independent and discovered that independence meant independence from her? "I don't know," I said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" He paused, and for a moment I heard echoes of the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to ask me to check for monsters under his bed because he trusted me to keep him safe from things that scared him. "I want to fix this. I want my mom back." His mom. The woman who'd put his needs before her own for 28 years, who'd absorbed his disappointment and criticism without complaint, who'd made herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared entirely. The woman who'd apologized for existing and begged for the privilege of remaining relevant in his life. That woman is gone, David, I said gently. She started disappearing the night you explained to a room full of strangers why she didn't matter. She finished disappearing the day you told her that helping her pay her bills would be too complicated for your marriage. But you're my mother. Yes, I am. I'm the woman who raised you, who loved you unconditionally, who sacrificed everything to give you the foundation you needed to build your life. I'll always be that woman, but I'm also someone else now, someone who knows her own worth, who doesn't apologize for taking up space, who doesn't need your approval to validate her existence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing words that probably sounded foreign coming from a woman he'd grown accustomed to managing rather than respecting. I saw the pictures, he said finally, in that magazine article. You looked different, happy. I am happy. For the first time in years, I'm genuinely happy. Without me. The pain in those two words almost broke my resolve. This was still my son, still the child I'd loved before I'd even seen his face, still the person whose happiness had mattered more to me than my own for nearly 3 decades. Not without you, I said carefully. Despite you. Despite the way you made me feel about myself. Despite the way you erased me from your life when I became inconvenient. I'm happy because I finally remembered that I exist, independent of your opinion of me. Mom. David, let me ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I hadn't started this business, if I was still struggling financially, if I was still the woman who embarrassed you at dinner parties, would you have called me? Would you be interested in fixing this if there wasn't a magazine article about my success? The silence that followed was answer enough. I thought so, I said. It's not like that, he protested, but we both knew it was exactly like that. Here's what I've learned, sweetheart. Love isn't supposed to be conditional on success or social acceptability or professional achievement. Love isn't supposed to evaporate when someone becomes inconvenient or complicated. Love isn't supposed to reappear when someone becomes useful again. I do love you. I believe you do. In your way. According to your definition of what love means, but your love comes with conditions I'm no longer willing to meet. I won't apologize for my past, my background, my struggles, or my limitations. I won't make myself smaller to make you more comfortable. I won't pretend that what happened between us was normal or acceptable or something we can just move past without acknowledging the damage that was done. So what are you saying? That you don't want a relationship with me anymore? The question hit me like a physical blow. Even though I'd been expecting it. This was the choice I'd been avoiding since his first voicemail, the decision I'd been trying not to make, even as I'd been building a life that didn't depend on his presence in it. I'm saying that I want a relationship with the son who respects me, who values what I contributed to his life, who doesn't treat my love like a burden to be managed. If that's who you are, or who you're willing to become, then yes, I want you in my life. But if you're still the man who thinks helping his mother is too complicated for his marriage, who sees my struggles as embarrassments and my successes as opportunities, then no, I don't want that relationship anymore. You're asking me to choose. No, David, I'm asking you to grow up. I'm asking you to decide what kind of man you want to be, what kind of son you want to be, what your values actually are when they're tested by inconvenience or social pressure, or your wife's family's opinions. And if I can't, if I'm not the person you want me to be, I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 28 years of motherhood, of dreams deferred, and sacrifices made and love given without reservation or condition. Then I'll be sad, I said simply. I'll always be sad that I couldn't give you what you needed to become a better man, but I won't be surprised. And I won't be waiting by the phone anymore, hoping for scraps of affection from someone who should have been offering me the world. The conversation ended quietly, without dramatic pronouncements or slammed phones. David said he needed time to think, and I told him to take all the time he needed. We said goodbye with the careful politeness of strangers, and then the line went dead. I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward, watching the light fade outside my window, feeling something that took me a while to identify. It wasn't relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. It wasn't satisfaction, though there was an element of that too. It was peace. The deep, quiet peace that comes from finally telling the truth and discovering that the world doesn't end when you stop pretending everything is fine. For the first time in 28 years, I had no idea whether my son would choose to be part of my life, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would be fine either way, and that knowledge felt like the most valuable thing I'd ever created. 2 months passed in the kind of productive rhythm I'd never imagined possible for my life. The furniture showroom exhibition had been more successful than anyone expected. 3 of my pieces sold on opening night, and I received commissions for custom work that would keep me busy through the winter. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story with the headline, "Local Artisans' Work Featured in Metropolitan Gallery," and suddenly I wasn't just Cecilia Morrison who made jewelry boxes in a storage unit. I was Cecilia Morrison, master craftsman, whose work was being recognized beyond our small community. The teaching opportunity at the community college had materialized into a regular position, 2 classes a week, helping adults discover the satisfaction of working with their hands. My students ranged from retired engineers looking for a new challenge to young mothers seeking creative outlets, and watching them transform raw lumber into something beautiful never got old. Margaret from book club had started bringing friends to see my workshop, and word was spreading through networks I'd never known existed. A writer from a national lifestyle magazine called about featuring my story in their series about women reinventing themselves after 50. The phone rang regularly now with inquiries about custom pieces, teaching requests, and interview opportunities. But the most significant change wasn't in my business or my growing reputation. It was in how I moved through the world. When I walked into a room now, I didn't apologize for taking up space. When people asked about my work, I spoke with confidence about my skills and experience. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who'd built something meaningful with her own hands and intelligence, not someone whose worth depended on other people's approval. Mrs. Chen had become more than just a neighbor. She was a friend who understood what it meant to build a life on your own terms. We had coffee together most mornings, sharing stories about our respective journeys and laughing about the surprises that came with discovering yourself in your later years. "My daughter called yesterday," Mrs. Chen told me one Tuesday morning as we sat in her small kitchen surrounded by the flowering plants she tended with the same care I devoted to my woodworking. "She wants to visit next month. Says she's proud of how independent I've become since her father died." "How does that feel?" I asked, knowing the complicated emotions that could arise when family members suddenly noticed your growth. "Good," she said after thinking for a moment, "but also strange. Like she's meeting me for the first time, instead of just finally seeing who I always was underneath the roles I used to play." I understood exactly what she meant. The woman I'd become wasn't a new creation. She was the woman I'd always been underneath 28 years of putting someone else's needs first, underneath decades of making myself smaller to make others more comfortable. On a Thursday afternoon in early September, while I was putting the finishing touches on a hope chest that would be featured in a furniture magazine's holiday issue, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time since our confrontation, I felt no anxiety about answering. "Hello, David." "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded different, less confident, more tentative than I'd heard in years. "I was wondering if we could talk, in person, if you're willing." "I'm willing to listen," I said carefully. "Could I come by your place? Or maybe we could meet somewhere neutral, if that would be more comfortable." The fact that he was asking rather than assuming told me something had shifted in how he was thinking about our relationship. "You can come here," I said. Saturday afternoon would work. He arrived exactly on time, standing at my door with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. He'd lost weight, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd been sleeping poorly. When I opened the door, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, uncertainty mixed with hope, and the kind of vulnerability that comes from not knowing what to expect. "Come in," I said, stepping back to give him room. He'd never been to my apartment before, I realized. During all the months of his marriage, all the family gatherings I'd been excluded from, he'd never once visited the place where his mother lived. He looked around now with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, taking in the simple furniture I'd chosen for comfort rather than impression, the photographs of my woodworking projects displayed on the walls, the sense of peace that had settled into every corner. "It's nice," he said, and seemed to mean it. "Peaceful. Would you like some coffee? Please." I made coffee the way I'd taught him when he was 12. Careful measurements, patience with the brewing process, attention to details that mattered. We sat at my small kitchen table, The same table where I'd eaten that desperate dinner of one egg and stale bread 6 months earlier, though it felt like a lifetime ago. "I need to apologize," David said without preamble, "for everything, for how I treated you, for the things I said, for making you feel like you didn't matter. You were right about all of it." I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue. "I've been thinking about what you said, about conditional love, about who I want to be as a person, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I became someone I don't recognize, someone who measured worth by income and social status instead of character and sacrifice." "What changed?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answers were written in the dark liquid. "Rebecca and I separated 3 weeks ago." I felt a flicker of surprise but kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" he asked, looking up at me with something that might have been relief. "I'm sorry that you're going through pain," I said honestly. "I'm not sorry if it's helped you see things more clearly. It has." When she left, her father made it very clear that my career prospects with their family's connections would be leaving with her. Suddenly all those networking opportunities, all that social climbing I thought was so important, none of it mattered if I wasn't the right son-in-law anymore. And how did that feel? Like discovering that everything I thought was solid was actually built on sand. Like realizing I'd traded away the most important relationship in my life for relationships that disappeared the moment they stopped being convenient. I nodded but didn't speak. This was his revelation to process, his growth to claim or reject. I started thinking about what you'd said, about love being conditional, and I realized that's exactly what I'd done. I'd made my love for you conditional on you being the kind of mother who enhanced my image rather than complicated it. I'd made your worth dependent on how you reflected on me instead of recognizing what you'd given me. And what had I given you? Everything, he said simply. Love, sacrifice, support, the foundation that made everything else possible. You gave me everything, and I threw it away because I was ashamed of where I came from instead of proud of how far we'd both traveled. The words hung between us, heavy with the weight of recognition too long delayed. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of hurt I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. "I saw the article in the National magazine," he continued. "The one about your teaching, about the furniture gallery, about the business you built from nothing. And I realized that while I was busy being embarrassed by your background, you were creating something beautiful and meaningful and lasting. You were becoming the kind of person I'd only pretended to be." I didn't become someone different, David. I remembered who I always was. I know. That's what makes this so much worse. You were always this strong, always this capable, always this remarkable. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy looking at you through other people's eyes instead of my own. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Not the careful, surface-level conversations we'd had for years, but the kind of deep, honest dialogue that had once defined our relationship. David told me about the loneliness he'd felt in his marriage, surrounded by people who valued him for his potential rather than his character. I told him about the months of doubt and desperation, but also about the joy I'd discovered in building something with my own hands and heart. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, as the afternoon light began to fade outside my kitchen window. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness wasn't something to be given lightly, not after the depth of hurt that had been inflicted. But looking at my son, really seeing him for the first time in years, I recognized something I'd almost given up hope of finding: genuine remorse, real growth, the possibility of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. "I can forgive you," I said finally, "but things can't go back to the way they were." "I don't want them to," he said quickly. "I want them to be better. I want to know the woman you've become. I want to earn the right to be part of your life instead of taking that place for granted." 6 months later, David was a regular presence in my workshop, learning woodworking techniques with the same intensity he'd once brought to legal briefs. He'd taken a position with a smaller firm that valued work-life balance over social connections, and he spoke about his colleagues with genuine affection rather than strategic calculation. We had dinner together every Sunday, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at the small house he'd rented after the divorce. Our conversations covered everything from literature to politics to the particular satisfaction of creating something beautiful that would last for generations. But the greatest gift wasn't David's return to my life. It was the realization that I no longer needed his presence to feel complete. I'd learned to find joy and purpose and satisfaction independent of anyone else's approval or participation. He was welcome in my world now, but he wasn't the center of it. I'd raised him to be independent, and in the end, his independence had taught me my own. On a warm evening in late spring, as we worked together on a bookshelf he was making for his apartment, David looked up from the piece he was sanding and said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. Proud of what you've built. Proud of who you've become. I should have said that years ago." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. But I also knew something he was still learning. The opinion that mattered most was my own. I'd spent 28 years living for someone else's pride, someone else's approval, someone else's definition of success. Now I lived for the satisfaction of work well done, for the joy of creation, for the peace that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I brought to the world. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept love that comes with conditions. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from relationships that require you to diminish yourself. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is remember that you existed before you became someone's mother, and you'll exist long after they stop needing you to. At 59, I was finally living the life I'd always been meant to live, not as an appendage to someone else's story, but as the author of my own. And it was beautiful.